At 9:47 p.m. Eastern Standard Time tonight, just 7 hours after Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney reinstated emergency measures in response to President Trump's attempt to reinterpret congressional override legislation, the situation between the United States and Canada reached an extraordinary turning point. As the United States government slid deeper into constitutional chaos over Trump's refusal to implement what Congress had mandated, Mark Carney carried out something unprecedented in the history of international diplomacy. He called a live, globally televised press conference and invited world leaders from 50 different countries to participate through a video link. For 43 minutes, the broadcast aired live to an estimated audience of nearly 800 million viewers across the world. During that event, Carney and leaders from the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Japan, Brazil, Mexico, Australia, South Korea, and more than 40 other nations took turns delivering statements about the escalating U.S.-Canada crisis. However, these were not the usual cautious diplomatic comments designed to avoid offending Washington. Instead, they were blunt and striking assessments about American reliability, American credibility, and the current state of American leadership. One after another, leaders of America's closest allies stood in front of cameras and declared on the record that the United States under Trump could no longer be trusted, that American commitments had lost their value, that alliances with the United States were becoming risky, and that the world must begin constructing systems capable of functioning without American participation. This was not quiet diplomatic criticism whispered behind closed doors. It was public humiliation of the United States on a scale that had rarely, if ever, been witnessed before. The entire world watched as America's traditional allies lined up to say that American leadership had collapsed. Carney orchestrated every part of the event, carefully positioning Canada as a defender of international order while portraying the United States as a rogue actor that disregards agreements, threatens its neighbors, and undermines its own democratic institutions. Trump woke up this morning as President of the United States. He is going to sleep tonight as the leader of a nation many around the world now view as isolated and rejected. In this breakdown, I'm going to walk you through the most damaging statements delivered by world leaders during Carney's press conference. I'll also explain how Carney structured the event to maximize global impact and humiliation, while presenting the Democratic Trade Alliance as the future of international cooperation. We'll look at the immediate reaction inside Washington and why U.S. officials are already describing this as one of the worst diplomatic disasters in American history. I'll also explain why global leaders chose to make these criticisms publicly rather than through traditional diplomatic channels. Finally, we'll examine what global leadership might look like in a world where the United States has been publicly rejected by many of its own allies. Let's begin with how Carney structured the press conference, because every part of it appeared designed to demonstrate global consensus against the United States. Carney opened the event by explaining the purpose of the gathering. He said that for the past month, Canada had been engaged in a dispute with the United States over fundamental principles: respect for sovereignty, adherence to international agreements, and the peaceful resolution of disagreements between democratic allies. According to Carney, the United States had demonstrated earlier in the day that it no longer respected those principles. He explained that the U.S. Congress had exercised its constitutional authority and passed legislation accepting Canada's 5 requirements. Yet only hours later, the President of the United States released implementation terms that contradicted what Congress had approved. Carney said that this was not simply a Canadian problem but a global one. If the United States could violate agreements with Canada, its largest trading partner and one of its closest allies, then no country could feel secure relying on American commitments. He then explained that leaders from around the world had been invited to share their perspectives about what the U.S.-Canada crisis means for international relations and for the future of global cooperation. Carney then introduced the first speaker, UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer. Appearing via video link from 10 Downing Street, Starmer delivered a striking statement. He said the United Kingdom had been America's closest ally for more than a century. The two countries had fought wars together, built international institutions together, and trusted American leadership for generations. But, according to Starmer, that trust had now been broken. Trump's treatment of Canada demonstrated that geographic proximity, historic partnership, and shared democratic values no longer protected nations from American pressure. If Canada, a G7 democracy, could be threatened with economic destruction, then any nation could face the same treatment. Starmer said the United Kingdom supported Canada's position and believed the international community must build frameworks that do not depend on American reliability, because that reliability had disappeared. Next to speak was French President Emmanuel Macron. Macron said France had watched with growing concern as the United States violated trade agreements, threatened allies, and undermined democratic norms. He argued that the U.S.-Canada crisis was not an isolated incident, but the culmination of years of American retreat from the rules-based international order that the United States itself had once helped build. France stood firmly with Canada, he said, and Europe must accelerate its efforts toward strategic autonomy from the United States. According to Macron, Europe could no longer depend on a partner that repeatedly failed to honor its commitments. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz spoke third. Scholz explained that Germany and the United States had rebuilt the post-war world together. That partnership, he said, had always been based on shared commitments to democracy, free trade, and peaceful conflict resolution. But President Trump had abandoned those commitments. Germany therefore supported the Democratic Trade Alliance as an alternative framework for nations that still believed cooperation should be governed by rules rather than raw power. The era of American leadership, Scholz argued, was ending, not because America had been defeated by rivals, but because it had destroyed the trust that once made its leadership possible. Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida followed. Kishida reminded viewers that Japan is a treaty ally of the United States and that its security depends heavily on American commitments under the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty. However, he raised an important question. If American commitments to Canada, written into agreements such as USMCA and NORAD, could be ignored whenever politically convenient, why should Japan believe American security guarantees would be more reliable? Japan supports Canada, he said, and Tokyo is now re-evaluating whether exclusive reliance on American security guarantees truly serves Japanese interests. Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva spoke next. Lula said Latin America understands very well what it means to face pressure from the United States. For decades, nations in the region had been told that partnership with America was essential for prosperity and security. Canada, he argued, had proven that assumption false. By standing up to American pressure, Canada showed that nations can defend their sovereignty, build alternative partnerships, and thrive without Washington's approval. Brazil stands with Canada, Lula said, and Latin America is building a future where sovereignty is protected by regional cooperation, rather than by hoping the United States chooses to respect it. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum followed. She pointed out that Mexico shares a border with the United States just as Canada does. For years, she said, the United States had threatened Mexico with tariffs, border walls, immigration restrictions, and economic pressure. Canada's willingness to confront those tactics directly was inspiring. Mexico therefore joins Canada in supporting the Democratic Trade Alliance and commits to working with nations that believe sovereignty cannot be negotiated away. Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese spoke next. Australia, he said, is part of the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance and a treaty ally of the United States through ANZUS. Australian forces have fought beside American troops in nearly every major conflict for a century. Yet the U.S.-Canada crisis shows that alliance with America does not necessarily mean partnership. It can mean subordination. When the United States demands something, allies are expected to comply. When allies defend their own interests, the United States retaliates. Australia therefore supports Canada and is expanding its security partnerships because reliance on the United States has become a strategic vulnerability. South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol also addressed the conference. He noted that South Korea faces existential security threats and has relied on American protection for 70 years. But Trump's willingness to abandon Canada raised an uncomfortable question. Would the United States abandon South Korea if Seoul pursued policies Washington disliked? South Korea cannot take that risk. The country supports Canada and is strengthening its independent defense capabilities because American protection can no longer be assumed to be unconditional. The statements continued as leaders from Norway, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, the Netherlands, Belgium, Spain, Italy, Poland, Chile, Colombia, Argentina, Singapore, New Zealand, and dozens of other nations echoed similar concerns. Their message was consistent. The United States had become unreliable, American leadership was weakening, and the world was beginning to build alternatives. By the time the final speaker finished, 47 nations representing more than 60% of global GDP and over half of the world's population had publicly stated that the United States could no longer be trusted. Carney closed the press conference with a message directed not at Trump but at the American public. He said he wanted to speak directly to Americans watching the broadcast. According to Carney, Congress had done the right thing that day by voting overwhelmingly to accept Canada's requirements and end the crisis. Yet the president had refused to implement the legislation passed by Congress. This was not about Canada versus the United States, he said. It was about whether democracy functions and whether the rule of law still matters. Congress understood this. The rest of the world understood this. Carney said he hoped Americans understood it as well. He added that Congress would act again the following day to ensure proper implementation of the agreement. Canada would be watching closely, and so would the rest of the world. The question, he said, was whether American democracy was strong enough to restrain a president who believed he stood above the law. The press conference ended, but its impact spread instantly. Within minutes, clips were circulating across social media platforms. Within an hour, it became the top news story in almost every country. Within 2 hours, analysts were already describing it as the most significant diplomatic moment since the end of the Cold War. The United States had effectively been rejected by much of the international community, not through a vote at the United Nations or a formal protest, but through a coordinated televised declaration by 47 nations that American leadership had ended. Meanwhile, in Washington, senior officials watched the event unfold in real time. According to sources, the atmosphere inside the White House was described as somber and tense. Officials reportedly understood that they were witnessing a collapse of American credibility and that there was little they could do to stop it. Around 10:15 p.m., the National Security Advisor called an emergency meeting. Officials debated whether the United States should respond publicly to the press conference or remain silent. Many argued that responding would only amplify the humiliation. At 10:30 p.m., Trump himself was informed about the event. According to reports, he initially dismissed it as fake news and claimed that world leaders had been pressured by Canada to participate. But when aides showed him video clips from the broadcast, he reportedly became furious and demanded that the State Department issue retaliatory statements against every country involved. Officials warned him that retaliating against 47 countries simultaneously would be impossible and counterproductive. Trump reportedly insisted he didn't care and said those countries should be punished for disrespecting him. Shortly before 11 p.m., the State Department released a brief statement despite internal objections. It said the United States was disappointed that some nations had chosen to participate in what it called a one-sided propaganda event organized by Canada. The statement warned that nations turning their backs on America would regret it. Many analysts noted that the tone of the response appeared defensive and threatening, exactly the pattern world leaders had criticized earlier during the press conference. Around 11:30 p.m., congressional leaders issued their own joint statement. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and House leadership said they had watched as 47 nations publicly declared that the United States could no longer be trusted. They said this had happened because President Trump violated agreements, threatened allies, and now refused to implement legislation passed by Congress. They promised that Congress would pass clarification legislation the following morning, removing any presidential discretion over implementation. According to the statement, American credibility would be restored by demonstrating that American democracy can still constrain an out-of-control president. By midnight, the Democratic Trade Alliance Secretariat announced that 15 additional countries had applied for membership following the global broadcast. If accepted, the alliance could soon include more than 65 nations representing over 70% of global GDP. The organization was quickly becoming the primary framework for international economic cooperation, gradually replacing institutions traditionally led by the United States. Shortly afterward, Canadian officials announced further economic steps. Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland said Canada would coordinate with alliance members to reduce collective holdings of U.S. dollars and U.S. Treasury securities by roughly 50% over the next 6 months. That would represent more than $4 trillion in assets potentially shifting out of American markets, a move analysts warned could destabilize financial systems and dramatically increase U.S. borrowing costs. Diplomatic experts later explained why world leaders chose to make their criticism public rather than through traditional diplomatic channels. According to them, private pressure had repeatedly failed because Trump ignored advice from allies, his own administration, and even Congress. Public pressure serves several purposes. It mobilizes American public opinion by demonstrating how the world perceives U.S. actions. It provides political cover for Congress to take stronger action against presidential defiance. It creates a historical record showing that allies openly opposed policies they believed were harmful. And it accelerates the creation of alternative international frameworks by signaling widespread support. From here, analysts describe 3 possible scenarios for the global order after this humiliation. The first is rapid American rehabilitation. Congress could pass clarification legislation with veto-proof majorities, forcing proper implementation. Trump might face impeachment and possibly resign, allowing a new administration to begin rebuilding trust. Even then, however, the United States might never fully regain the unquestioned leadership it once held. The second scenario is the emergence of a permanent multipolar order. In that world, global governance gradually shifts away from U.S. dominance. The Democratic Trade Alliance becomes the dominant economic framework. NATO restructures to reduce American influence. The dollar loses some of its reserve status, and global power becomes distributed among several centers such as the United States, China, the European Union, and the DTA. The third scenario is deeper American isolation. If Trump refuses to implement congressional legislation and political paralysis continues, allies might conclude that U.S. dysfunction is permanent. Over time, nations could decouple from American markets, security guarantees, and institutions. By the end of the decade, the United States might remain powerful but increasingly isolated, similar to other large nations excluded from the cooperative systems that drive global prosperity. For now, the world is watching closely. Congress will meet again tomorrow. Financial markets are waiting to see whether major institutions begin reducing dollar holdings, and governments everywhere are calculating their next steps. Mark Carney publicly humiliated Trump on the global stage. 47 nations rejected American leadership in front of hundreds of millions of viewers, and whether the damage proves temporary or permanent may depend on what happens next in Washington.